Top 1. The Eleusinian Mysteries. Every major mind of the ancient world entered a darkened hall in a small coastal town 18 miles west of Athens, consumed a specific drink, and emerged as a completely transformed individual. Plato, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius all participated, yet not one of them ever disclosed exactly what occurred inside. For nearly 2,000 years, that secret remained intact until a laboratory in Barcelona cracked the mystery in 2021. The sanctuary at Eleusis had been operating continuously since approximately 1500 BCE, a date that is not a typo. From 1500 BCE to 396 CE, nearly 1,900 years of unbroken ritual were attended by every significant emperor, philosopher, and general the ancient Mediterranean world produced. The ceremony was known as the Eleusinian Mysteries, and the single rule governing it was absolute. Initiates, called mystai, were bound by a penalty of death never to reveal what happened inside the initiation hall. Athenian law treated such disclosure as a capital crime equivalent to sacrilege. In 415 BCE, the general Alcibiades was condemned to death and stripped of his property in absentia, partly for allegedly performing a private imitation of the mysteries at a dinner party. He never returned to Athens. The secret was not metaphorical, it was strictly enforced. The central sacrament was a potion called the kykeon, a mixture of water, mint, and barley. That is the official description, simple enough for a wellness retreat. However, in 1978, chemist Albert Hofmann, the man who first synthesized LSD, joined classical scholar Carl Ruck and ethnomycologist Gordon Wasson to publish The Road to Eleusis. Their argument was specific and technical. The barley used in the kykeon was almost certainly infected with ergot, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which contains lysergic acid amide, a chemical relative of LSD. The hallucinations produced by ergot-contaminated grain had been documented throughout European history. What if they weren't accidental? What if they were the point? For decades, this was treated as interesting speculation. Then in 2021, a peer-reviewed study in Scientific Reports by González Escrig and colleagues analyzed residue from a ceramic cup recovered at Mas Castellar de Pontos in Spain, a sanctuary linked to the Eleusinian tradition. The results confirmed the presence of ergot alkaloids, a psychoactive compound, in a ritual cup at an Eleusinian site. The telesterion, the initiation hall, could hold up to 3,000 initiates simultaneously. It was the largest single-roof structure in ancient Greece. Whatever happened inside happened to crowds, and the testimony of those crowds, filtered through the philosophical works they produced afterward, is remarkably consistent. Plato writes in the Phaedo that those who have been initiated can face death without fear because they have already seen what lies beyond it. Cicero writes that Eleusis gave him not only a way to live joyfully, but a way to die with better hope. These are not the words of men describing a theatrical performance. These are the words of men describing something that worked. The mainstream explanation is that the mysteries combine fasting, dramatic theatrical staging, clever lighting, and the powerful psychology of collective initiation to produce genuine religious experiences. Scholars note that sensory deprivation, emotional preparation, and group ritual are well-documented tools for inducing altered states. The experience was real, they argue, but the mechanism was psychological, not pharmacological. But that explanation requires us to believe that Plato, who spent his career building the most rigorous, rational philosophy the ancient world produced, found unshakable metaphysical certainty in theatrical lighting and an empty stomach. It requires us to explain why Cicero traveled to a small town near Athens to experience something he could have gotten from any Greek theater. And it now requires us to explain why ergot alkaloids were sitting in the ritual cup. When Emperor Theodosius ordered the sanctuary destroyed in 396 CE, his agents did not merely demolish the building. The hereditary priestly families, the Eumolpidae and the Kerykes, had kept written records of the ceremony's content for generations. Those records were confiscated and destroyed. The philosopher Eunapius, writing shortly after, described the erasure as a civilizational catastrophe, not a religious reform, a catastrophe. So here is the question that archaeology now forces us to ask. If the foundation of ancient philosophy's most confident claim, that the soul survives death, was built on a chemically induced experience that a priestly family could produce on demand in a crowded hall? What exactly did they know? And why was the first thing the new religious order did when it took power the systematic destruction of every record that could tell us? Top 2. The Aztec Zompantli. When the Spanish conquistadors entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, one of Hernán Cortés's own soldiers, a man named Andrés de Tapia, stopped in front of a structure and started counting. He counted for a long time. His estimate when he finished, 136,000 human skulls. His account was filed away. For 500 years, historians called it an exaggeration. Then in 2017, they started digging under Mexico City. The sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan lies directly beneath the colonial-era streets of modern downtown Mexico City, specifically under the intersection of República de Guatemala and República de Argentina. The excavation was led by archaeologist Leonardo López Luján of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. What they found beginning in 2015 and continuing through 2020 was the Huitzompantli, the Great Skull Rack, exactly where the Spanish accounts said it would be, and substantially as they described it. The cylindrical skull tower, called the Ejecatl, measured approximately 35 meters in diameter. López Luján's team identified over 650 skulls in a single excavated section, each one cemented into the structure with lime and plaster. The scaling mathematics are not comfortable. Forensic osteological analysis showed that approximately 75% of the skulls belong to adult males. But that number leaves room for the other 25%. Women, children, individuals whose presence in the tower demolished the narrative that only warrior captives from battlefield sacrifice ended up here. Isotopic analysis of the teeth told a further story. The chemical composition of tooth enamel records where a person grew up, the specific mineral signature of their childhood water and soil. Multiple skulls in the Tzompantli showed signatures from geographically distant regions. These were not local captives. They were brought to Tenochtitlan from across Mesoamerica, from places that required weeks of travel specifically for this purpose. The logistics of that operation suggest a supply network of continental scale that the Spanish account somehow failed to fully convey. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún from Aztec informants in the 1560s, describes the Tzompantli ritual in precise liturgical detail. The specific priest caste responsible, the specific calendar dates required, the specific positioning of the victim's body during execution. This was not improvised, it was administered. It ran on a schedule. Scholars broadly accept all of this. Now, the mainstream interpretation frames the Tzompantli as a central expression of Aztec solar religion. The sun god Huitzilopochtli required blood to rise each morning, and the display of skulls was both a theological statement and a political one, a demonstration of Aztec military supremacy visible to every visiting dignitary and subject people. The scale was the point. Terror was a governance tool. But here is what that framing doesn't fully address. After the Spanish conquest, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza ordered the systematic burning of pictographic Aztec codices beginning in the 1520s. Of the estimated 400 to 500 codices in existence at the moment of contact, fewer than 20 survive today. Then the site itself was built over, first with a colonial church, then with centuries of urban infrastructure, ensuring that the physical evidence was inaccessible for 500 years. And during those 500 years, the scale of what de Tapia had described was consistently minimized in mainstream scholarship. 136,000 became an obvious exaggeration. The tower became a modest rack. The women and children disappeared from the narrative entirely. The 2017 excavation didn't just confirm the Tzompantli, it confirmed that the minimization had been wrong all along. The question some researchers are now asking is not how many skulls were in the tower, but why it took 5 centuries for anyone to look. The erasure here was not a single dramatic act of destruction. It was slow, institutional, and remarkably effective. The rubble of a colonial church was piled on top, and academic consensus did the rest. The tower was real, the scale was real, and someone spent 500 years making sure you didn't know that. Top 3, the Capacocha ritual. She was 6 years old. She was dressed in the finest wool the Inca Empire could produce. She had been fed coca leaves for months, and she walked for weeks across the spine of the Andes to a mountain summit 22,000 feet above sea level, where the air is too thin for most adults to function, and the cold at night drops to temperatures that kill. At the top, she was given a final cup of chicha beer, placed in a small stone chamber, and sealed inside. She was found in 1999. Her face was still perfect. Her eyelashes were still intact. Her expression even now looks peaceful. The question is not how she died. The question is what the people who brought her there had spent a year doing to her. The three children recovered from Mount Lulelaco in Salta province, Argentina, known to researchers as the Maiden, the Boy, and the Lightning Girl, were discovered in March 1999 by archaeologist Johann Reinhardt during a National Geographic expedition. Radiocarbon dating places their deaths at approximately 1500 CE. They are the best preserved pre-Columbian mummies in existence, and they are not anomalies. They are data points in a continent-spanning ritual system called Cappacotia. In 2013, a team led by Andrew Wilson published an analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that traced the chemical record in the children's hair shafts across the final year of their lives. Hair grows at a known rate. Each centimeter is a time capsule. What the analysis found was not a single dose of sedative administered at the end. It was a 12-month escalating program. Coca consumption increased sharply in the final year. Alcohol was introduced in the final weeks. By the time the children reached the summit, their neurochemistry had been systematically altered across 365 days of graduated pharmacological preparation. That is not mercy, that is a protocol. Someone understood well enough to execute it precisely that a year of gradually increasing coca and alcohol would produce a specific psychological state in a child: compliant, altered, ceremonially present, but neurologically distant from fear. The maiden showed no signs of physical trauma. The cause of death was hypothermia while sedated. The Lightning Girl, only 6 years old, was buried with 36 distinct artifacts, including miniature gold and silver figurines. She had been chosen for her physical perfection: no blemishes, no illness, no imperfection of any kind. And the preparation that followed her selection was the most expensive thing the Inca state could offer. Capacocha was not a local practice. Spanish colonial chronicler Cristobal de Molina, writing around 1575, describes the ritual as requiring direct authorization from the Sapa Inca himself, transport of the children along the royal road network, and coordination with regional governors across the empire. Over 100 Capacocha burial sites have been identified across the Andes, from Peru to Chile to Argentina, at altitudes between 17,000 and 22,000 feet. Each required its own ascent route, supply chain, and ceremonial infrastructure. The mainstream interpretation frames Capacocha as the highest possible offering in Inca cosmology. The children were not victims in any sense the culture recognized. They were gifts elevated to divine status, escorted to the mountain deities, and understood to continue existing in a sacred form after death. The care taken with their burial, the quality of their clothing and offerings, and the gentleness of the sedation method are all consistent with a culture that believed it was honoring, not harming, these children. But the pharmacological precision is the part that resists easy comfort. The 12-month preparation isn't kindness applied to an inevitable ritual, it is engineering. Someone in the Inca priestly system had accumulated enough empirical knowledge of pediatric pharmacology to design a year-long neurological preparation program and transmit it reliably across a continent-spanning empire. That knowledge was then systematically targeted for destruction by Viceroy Francisco de Toledo's administrative reforms in the 1570s, which specifically suppressed Andean religious records to prevent the continuation of indigenous ritual traditions. The frozen children are still there. The protocol that brought them to the summit is mostly gone. What remains is the hair, 2 centimeters of coca and chicha in deliberate preparation, telling us that whoever designed this ritual understood something about the human mind that we are only now, with modern chemistry, beginning to measure. Top 4. The Necromantian of Ephyra. You have been fasting for 3 days. You have eaten only beans, pork fat, and shellfish, foods that the priest told you would open your mind to the dead. You have been kept in a room with no windows for long enough that you have lost track of whether it is day or night. Now a robed figure leads you down a stone corridor that smells of sulfur and cold water, through 12 locked bronze doors, each one sealing behind you. Somewhere in the dark ahead, something is moving. It sounds like a voice you recognize. This was not a nightmare. This was a functioning institution operating in northwestern Greece for over 4 centuries. And when the Roman general Aemilius Paulus shut it down in 167 BCE, he didn't just close it, he burned it to the foundation and buried it under rubble. The Necromanteon, the oracle of the dead, stood at ancient Ephra on a hill above the confluence of the rivers Acheron and Cocytus, which the ancient Greeks had identified as the rivers of the underworld. The geography was not coincidental. Greek cosmology located the entrance to Hades at the precise spot where these two rivers met. The sanctuary was the architectural exploitation of that belief, engineered to make what the myth promised, contact with the dead, experientially real. The site was excavated by Greek archaeologist Sotirios Dakaris between 1958 and 1964. What he found was a multi-story underground complex with stone corridors, a central hall identified as the Hall of Persephone, and an inner sanctum accessible only through the sequence of 12 bronze doors. The preparation rooms adjacent to the corridors contained something unexpected: large deposits of lupin seeds. Lupin seeds contain alkaloids, including lupinine and spartine, which in sufficient concentrations produce disorientation, altered perception of time, and hallucinatory states. Alongside the lupin seeds were burned barley, broad beans, and pork bones, a specific combination that later classical writers described as the required preparatory diet for anyone seeking contact with the underworld. Dakaris also recovered what he interpreted as a bronze crane mechanism from the inner sanctum, a theatrical lifting device consistent with the lowering or raising of robed figures in complete darkness to simulate the rising of spirits. And the site sits above a natural limestone cave system. The geological composition of the bedrock is consistent with the emission of low-level gases, including hydrogen sulfide, which at sufficient concentrations produces dissociation, visual disturbance, and altered time perception. The same effect documented at the Oracle of Delphi by geologist Jelle de Boer. Herodotus and Pausanias both describe the Necromanteon as a place where petitioners received messages from the dead following a preparation period of days. The Spartan general Pausanias was said to have consulted it to receive a message from a woman he had murdered. These were not fringe accounts. The site appears in multiple independent Greek and Roman sources as a functioning institution with a known address and a known procedure. The mainstream interpretation accepts the Necromanteon as sophisticated religious theater. The priests combine sensory deprivation, dietary manipulation, atmospheric staging, and theatrical machinery to produce experiences that felt to ancient minds, primed by mythology, like genuine supernatural contact. It worked because the ancient Greek psychological framework made it work. The brain fills in what it is prepared to see. The Romans destroyed it because it was a politically dangerous oracle, not because it was theologically threatening. But there is a difference between theater and engineering. Theater requires willing suspension of disbelief. What the Necromanteon's design describes is something else: multiple simultaneous mechanisms: pharmacological, geological, sensory, theatrical, any one of which could be dismissed as coincidence, but which in combination constitute a system. The lupin seeds do something specific to the brain. The gas does something specific to the brain. 3 days of fasting and darkness do something specific to the brain. The bronze doors in the complete darkness do something specific to the brain. Someone designed all of these inputs to work together, refined the combination across generations of practice, and produced a repeatable result in the vast majority of subjects. That is not theater. That is a technology for manufacturing a specific neurological experience. And the Roman general who burned it to the ground and buried it under rubble was not motivated by politics alone. You don't bury a theater, you bury something that works. Top 5, the Taurobolium. Stand on Vatican Hill in Rome today, and you are standing on the holiest ground in Christendom. Beneath your feet, under the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica, under the bones of emperors and popes, is a layer of soil that once held something else entirely. An altar, a pit dug into the hillside and carved into stone above that pit in Latin. Words that the early church did not just abandon, but physically chiseled from the rock, reborn for eternity. Those words belonged to a different ritual first. They promised a different resurrection, and for 4 centuries they were kept on Vatican Hill until someone decided that promise could only belong to one religion and took a chisel to the stone. The Toribolium was the central initiation rite of the cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, whose worship was formally imported to Rome in 204 BCE by order of the Roman Senate itself, based on a Sibylline oracle during the Second Punic War. This was not a fringe cult. It was a state-sponsored mystery religion, the first officially sanctioned foreign cult in Roman history, and it operated on Vatican Hill for over 5 centuries. The ritual has been described most completely by the Christian writer Prudentius, writing around 400 CE in his Parastephanon. An initiate climbed into a pit dug into the earth. Above the pit, a massive bull was led onto a platform of perforated wooden planks. The priest raised the blade. In the minutes that followed, the blood of the bull, ancient sources describe it as torrential, fell through the planks onto the person below, who raised their face into the stream and did not look away. When they climbed out of the pit, drenched from crown to foot, the watching crowd called them renatus in aeternum, reborn for eternity. That phrase appears on altar dedications recovered from Vatican Hill and from the Palatine Hill Sanctuary, inscriptions now housed in the Vatican Museum's epigraphic collection. The dates on those inscriptions run from 160 CE to 390 CE, meaning the Toribolium was still being performed on Vatican Hill within 10 years of Theodosius III, making Christianity the sole legal religion of the Roman Empire. The theological competition was not ancient history, it was current events. What happened next is visible in the stone itself. At least 11 Vatican Hill Toribolium altar inscriptions show evidence of deliberate chiseling. Not the altars remain, but the dedications. The names of Cybele and Attis, her consort, were physically removed from the rock while the stone structures were left standing. This is the specific signature of state-directed erasure, not natural decay. You chip out the name when you need the claim that name was making to belong exclusively to someone else. The cult of Cybele was officially suppressed by Theodosius's edicts following 391 CE. The Phrygianum, Cybele's Vatican Hill sanctuary, was then absorbed into the urban development of the area. When Pope Julius II began construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica in 1506, the excavations encountered what the later Vatican archaeological report from the 1951 publication Esplorazioni sotto la confessione di San Pietro describes as pre-Christian cultic layers in the hillside stratigraphy. The report notes this carefully and moves on. The mainstream view holds that St. Peter's was built on Vatican Hill because it was the traditional location of Peter's tomb. That is a genuine and well-documented tradition. The presence of a competing sanctuary on the same hill is attributed to the general density of religious sites in ancient Rome, where sacred precincts often overlapped. But here is the geography that is harder to explain away. The Phrygianum sanctuary was not somewhere near St. Peter's. The basilica's north transept covers the site of the Phrygianum directly, and the specific theological language of the ritual it replaced, blood that redeems, rebirth through death, eternal life granted to the initiate, is not merely parallel to Christian baptismal theology. It is structurally identical, using the same vocabulary, promising the same outcome, performed on the same hill. Some historians of late antique religion, including Ramsay MacMullen, argue that Christian sacred sites were not built near pagan sanctuaries by accident. They were built over them because the location was already understood to be a place where the divine was close. The claim was being staked, not just the real estate. The blood was washed away, the inscription was chiseled out, the building went up, and for 15 centuries, the hill kept its secret under the weight of everything built on top of it. Top 6. The Scythian Hemp Ritual. In 450 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus described a ritual so strange that the academic world spent the next 2,400 years calling it a fantasy. Scythian warriors, he wrote in his Histories, would erect small felt tents over heated stones, throw hemp seeds onto the stones, crawl inside the tents and breathe the vapor. They would, he said, howl with pleasure at the vapor bath. The ritual was their purification ceremony after burial. It was specific, it was detailed, and for nearly 100 generations of classical scholars, it was dismissed as one of Herodotus's famous tall tales about the barbarian peoples at the edge of the known world. Then in the middle of the 20th century, Soviet archaeologist Sergei Ivanovich Rudenko opened a series of frozen burial mounds in the Altai Mountains and found exactly what Herodotus had described. The Pazyryk kurgans of southern Siberia, excavated by Rudenko between 1947 and 1954 and published in English translation as Frozen Tombs of Siberia in 1970, are among the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. The permafrost preserved not just bone and metal, but textiles, food, wooden objects, and organic materials that would have decomposed entirely in less favorable conditions. Inside multiple burial chambers, Rudenko found bronze cauldrons containing carbonized hemp seeds and heated stones. He found felt textile fragments consistent with the tent construction Herodotus had described. He found the tent pole structures. In at least 6 separate kurgan excavations, cannabis pollen and fiber were confirmed by laboratory analysis. The dates align. The Pazyryk culture is dated to approximately 500 to 300 BCE by dendrochronology, tree ring dating of the wooden burial chambers, placing the physical evidence contemporaneous with or slightly earlier than Herodotus's account. He was not describing something he heard secondhand from a confused traveler. He was describing in accurate technical detail a practice that was actively occurring in his own lifetime. The specific method is worth examining closely. The Scythians used hemp seeds, not the resin-rich flower heads that produce stronger effects. They applied them to heated stones to release volatile compounds as vapor. This is a technically sophisticated delivery method, efficient, controllable, and requiring no processing of the plant beyond harvesting. It reflects the kind of empirical knowledge that accumulates across generations of practice, not accidental discovery. Archaeobotanist Andrew Sherritt, in his 1995 analysis of psychoactive plant use in prehistoric Eurasia, argued that this level of refinement points to a ritual tradition centuries older than the Pazyryk burials themselves, a tradition that Herodotus happened to observe and record at a particular moment in its long history. The mainstream now accepts the Scythian hemp ritual as confirmed. The academic consensus shifted after the physical evidence became impossible to ignore, and scholars currently frame the vapor bath as a funerary purification practice, a method of managing grief and spiritual transition using cannabis vapor in a controlled ceremonial setting. It is, in hindsight, elegant, a portable technology for producing a specific psychological state deployed at the moment of maximum emotional vulnerability, requiring no permanent infrastructure and leaving no obvious traces. But the 40-year gap between Rudenko's 1954 excavations and the broad academic acceptance of their implications is worth sitting with. The physical evidence was in the published literature. The hemp seeds were in the cauldrons. And for 4 decades, the dominant response from classical scholarship was to treat Herodotus's account as still essentially unverified. The Scythians left no writing system. Their ritual knowledge was transmitted orally and died with the culture. What Herodotus preserved, the specific technical description of felt tents, heated stones, and hemp seeds, was the only written record in existence, and the instinct apparently was to distrust it. Some researchers suggest that the resistance was not purely academic. A confirmed account of a sophisticated ancient pharmacological ritual tradition, one that worked, was refined over generations, and was transmitted across a continent-spanning nomadic culture, complicates the story of human progress in ways that are uncomfortable. Herodotus was right. He was right in every specific detail: the felt, the stones, the seeds, the howling. He saw it, he wrote it down, and for 2,400 years, the people who came after him decided he probably hadn't. Top 7. The Bog Bodies. The peat cutters who found him on May 8, 1950, outside Silkeborg, Denmark, stopped their work and called the police. He looked, they said, like he had died recently. His face was so perfectly preserved, the stubble still on his jaw, the closed eyes still soft, that the officers who responded assumed they were looking at a murder victim from the past few weeks. The forensic examination that followed established that he had been dead for approximately 2,400 years. His name, which no one knows, has been replaced by the place where he was found. We call him Tolland Man. He was hanged. The braided leather noose is still around his neck, the slipknot still tight, and then placed gently in the water on his side, eyes closed as if someone had tucked him in. He was not an anomaly. He was the pattern. P.V. Glob catalogued over 160 Danish bog bodies by the time his landmark study, The Bog People, was published in 1969. Subsequent surveys extending across the peat bogs of Denmark, England, Ireland, Germany, and the Netherlands have documented over 500 cases in total. What those 500 cases reveal when analyzed together is not random violence. It is a formula. Tolland Man was hanged. Grobala Man, dated to 310 to 55 BCE from a bog in central Denmark, had his throat cut so deeply the wound extended nearly to the cervical spine. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Lindo Man, discovered in 1984 at Lindo Moss in Cheshire, England, is the most striking example. He was struck twice on the skull with a blunt object, garroted with a sinew cord that fractured a cervical vertebra, and had his throat cut. 3 separate methods of killing applied to one person in sequence, deliberately. Forensic analysts Ian Stead, J.B. Bork, and Don Brothwell, in their 1986 study, Lindo Man, The Body in the Bog, described the triple death pattern as ritualistic, not chaotic, the difference between a killing staged with ceremonial purpose and a killing done in rage. The isotopic analysis of nitrogen levels in bone and teeth from multiple specimens consistently shows elevated markers for high-protein, high-status diets. These were not slaves. These were not criminals dragged from the lowest rung of society. They were eating like nobility in the years before their deaths. Miranda Aldhouse Green of Cardiff University, in her 2001 study, Dying for the Gods, documents the combination: high status, deliberate selection, elaborate multiple method killing, and careful placement afterward. Sometimes on a bed of birch branches, sometimes face down in the water, always with a specific orientation. Lindo Man's stomach contents added one more detail. His last meal included burned, unleavened bread made from multiple grain species, and the bread contained mistletoe pollen. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, specifically describes mistletoe as sacred in Druidic ritual, cut with a golden sickle, never allowed to touch the ground. Mistletoe in the last meal of a man killed 3 times in sequence with no defensive wounds, found in the bogs of northern England. Something was being communicated. The problem is that the culture communicating it left no written language. Scholars connect the triple death pattern to later medieval Irish texts, including the Togail Bruidne da Derga, which describes the ritual killing of a sacred king by 3 simultaneous methods as a requirement of the offering's completeness. Those texts were written roughly 1,000 years after the bog bodies were deposited. The fact that they describe the same technical procedure is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of a ritual tradition transmitted through oral culture for a millennium before anyone wrote it down. What no one recorded in any surviving text from any ancient Northern European source is the ceremony itself. Julius Caesar and Tacitus both describe Celtic and Germanic sacrifice in general terms. Neither specifies the triple death formula, and neither mentions the bogs as sacred sites. The knowledge of why these specific people were killed in this specific way, in this specific place, died with the priests who performed it, replaced eventually by a Christianity that had no reason to preserve what it had spent centuries suppressing. The bog kept the bodies. Everything else is silence. Top 8, the Carthaginian Topet. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, the general Scipio Aemilianus stood and watched the city burn for 17 days. Ancient sources tell us he wept, not from regret, but from the recognition that all great cities eventually fall, including his own. The Romans were thorough in their destruction. Libraries burned, the harbor was demolished, the fields were supposedly salted. But in a walled precinct behind the temple quarter of Carthage, in a neighborhood now called Salambo in modern Tunis, the ground held something the Romans didn't touch, something they may not have fully understood. 20,000 urns buried in shallow graves containing the cremated remains of children, accumulated over 6 unbroken centuries. They waited 2,000 years for someone to dig them up and look. The Tophet at Salambo was first excavated in 1921. The systematic archaeological study that established its true nature was conducted by Lawrence Steger of Harvard in the 1970s and 80s, with his findings published in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1980 and expanded in subsequent papers. What Steger found across the excavated sections of the sanctuary, which represent only a fraction of the full site, was more than 20,000 burial urns dated continuously from approximately 800 BCE to 146 BCE, 6 centuries of unbroken use. The urns contained cremated remains overwhelmingly belonging to children under 3 years of age, with a significant proportion showing gestational or neonatal bone development, meaning infants and the unborn. The revisionist interpretation that dominated scholarship from the 1970s through the 2000s held that the Tophet was simply a cemetery for children who had died naturally, an infant mortality burial ground in a culture with high childhood death rates. This interpretation was not without logic. Infant mortality was genuinely catastrophic in the ancient world, and a dedicated burial site for children who died young is not on its face surprising. Then in 2011, a team led by Josephine Quinn published isotopic analysis of Tophet specimens in PLOS One, the chemical composition of tooth enamel records where a person grew up, the mineral signature of their childhood water. The Quinn et al. Results showed that the victims were overwhelmingly local-born, children of Carthaginian families, not slaves, not outsiders, not the children of the poor and powerless, the children of Carthage's own citizens, drawn from across the social spectrum over 6 centuries. The stelae recovered from the Tophet carry dedicatory inscriptions. They read, translated from Punic, as variants of a gift to Baal-Hamon or as a vow to Tanit, the Carthaginian mother goddess. The language is sacrificial. It is not the language of grief. Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and the early Christian writer Tertullian all describe the practice called mulk in terms that are now archaeologically confirmed in their essential claims. Children were offered to the deity as the highest possible propitiatory act at moments of civic crisis by families who understood the act as devotional. The mainstream view now largely accepts that child sacrifice occurred at the Tophet, that it was practiced at state level across 6 centuries, and that the revisionist burial ground theory has been effectively overturned by the isotopic evidence. The scale and duration reflect a genuine theological tradition. Baal-Hamon required the greatest possible offering, and the greatest possible offering was the most precious thing a family possessed. But Josephine Quinn, in her 2018 book In Search of the Phoenicians, asks a different question. Why did 5 centuries of modern scholarship work so hard to find an alternative explanation for 20,000 urns? Why did the revisionist interpretation persist for 3 decades in the face of accumulating contrary evidence? She argues the answer is cultural proximity. We accept Aztec sacrifice because the Aztecs feel safely distant, pre-Columbian, non-Western, outside the civilizational lineage we claim. Carthage is Semitic, Mediterranean, and mercantile. It founded colonies across the Western Mediterranean. It competed with Rome and Greece. It is, in a real sense, a neighbor of the civilization we think we came from. And that, Quinn suggests, is precisely why the denial ran so long. Some truths are easier to bury than others, not in the ground, but in the academic consensus that decides what the ground is allowed to say. Top 9, the new fire ceremony. Once every 52 years, every fire in the Aztec Empire went out. Not metaphorically, literally. Every hearth, every torch, every temple brazier across a civilization of millions was extinguished at sunset. In every city, people climbed to their rooftops and watched the sky. Pregnant women were masked with maguey leaves and locked indoors because if the new fire failed, they would transform into monsters and devour their husbands. Children were kept awake by pinching because if they fell asleep on this specific night, they would turn to mice. Household goods were destroyed, old pottery was smashed, and on a hilltop south of the capital, a priest cut open the chest of a living man, a warrior chosen for his physical perfection, and attempted to drill fire from the incision with a wooden spindle. If it caught, the world would continue. If it didn't, the sky would fall and star demons called Sitsimime would descend to devour every living thing on earth. This was not metaphor. This was policy. The ceremony is called Toxumulpilia, the binding of the years, and it arose from the structure of the Aztec calendar system. The Aztec world ran on two simultaneous cycles, a 365-day solar calendar called the Xiuhpawali and a 260-day ritual calendar called the Tonalpawali. Every 18,980 days, every 52 years, these two cycles completed simultaneously, returning to their shared starting point, the calendar round. At that moment, the Aztec cosmological system entered a zone of maximum instability. The current world, the fifth sun, had been created and destroyed 4 previous times. There was no guarantee it would survive the completion of another cycle. Alfonso Caso's 1927 calendar correlation study identified the last pre-conquest new fire ceremony as occurring in November of 1507. The Codex Borbonicus, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian Aztec manuscripts, illustrates the Toxumulpilia sequence across multiple pages. The extinguishing of fires, the procession of priests to the Hill of the Star at Huixatlan, modern Cerro de la Estrella, south of Tenochtitlan, and the midnight astronomical observation of the Pleiades, called the Tianquistli, crossing the meridian. If the star cluster crossed at the right moment, the calendar had held. The fire could be drilled. Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex describes the rest in detail that reads like a production schedule. The sacrificial victim, dressed as the fire deity Xiuhpawali, was killed on the hilltop and fire was drilled in the open chest cavity. When it caught, runners carried it first to the great temple in Tenochtitlan, then by torch relay across the empire. The relay had to reach every city, every town, every household hearth by dawn. It covered hundreds of kilometers in a single night. UNAM archaeological studies of Cerro de la Estrella, led by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma's team in the 1990s, confirmed burned offerings and architectural modifications at the site consistent with periodic large-scale ritual use. The mainstream interpretation frames Toxumulpilia as the defining expression of Aztec cosmological anxiety, a civilization genuinely organized around the premise that the world was fragile and that human action, specifically sacrifice and ceremonial precision, was what kept it intact. The 52-year cycle was both theological and political. It concentrated imperial authority at the moment of cosmic vulnerability, with the Tlatoani as the indispensable mediator between the people and potential annihilation. But the astronomical dimension is the part that unsettles even the most straightforward reading. The ceremony required a specific observational result. The Pleiades had to cross the meridian at approximately midnight on the correct night, confirming that the solar calendar had not drifted from astronomical reality. The Tonalpuke, the specialist priestly caste responsible for the calendar, were therefore under a public, verifiable obligation every 52 years. Their calendar had to match the stars. Any drift would be visible to everyone on every rooftop in the empire simultaneously. When the Franciscan missionaries arrived after the conquest, they identified the destruction of the Tonalpoke's accumulated observational records as the single most efficient tool for breaking Aztec cosmological confidence. Robert Ricard's 1933 study, The Spiritual Conquest of Mexico, documents this as official colonial policy by 1525. The calendar records were destroyed not because they were false, they were destroyed because they were load-bearing. Without them, the 52-year cycle could no longer be verified. Without verification, the priest could no longer prove the sky wasn't falling. And without that proof, the world the ceremony had held together for centuries began quietly to end. 10 rituals, 10 cultures, From a drugged cup in Greece to a frozen child on an Andean peak, from a blood-soaked pit on Vatican Hill to a 20-day vigil and a rotting skin in the streets of Tenochtitlan. And running through all of them, a single thread that no textbook names directly. Every ritual on this list was documented by eyewitnesses, by archaeology, by forensic chemistry, by the bodies themselves. And in every case, something moved to erase it. The Romans burned the necromantean to the ground. The Spanish melted the codices. Theodosius's agents took chisels to the Vatican Hill inscriptions. European scholars dismissed the bog bodies as random violence and Herodotus as a storyteller for 24 centuries. 500 years of academic consensus looked at 20,000 Carthaginian urns and found reasons not to see what was in them. The mainstream explanation for each of these rituals is not wrong. Convergent religious psychology, political theater, agricultural symbolism, pharmacological ceremony. These are real frameworks and they explain real things. The Aztec state ran on genuine cosmological belief. The Greek priesthood performed genuine psychological work. The Inca ritual expressed genuine theological care. But the mainstream account is incomplete when it stops at the mechanics and declines to follow the mechanics to their destination. What these 10 rituals share is a certainty we have largely lost. The certainty that the boundary between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine, was not a fixed wall. It was a membrane, and it could be crossed with the right knowledge, the right chemistry, the right act of extreme transgression applied at the right moment, if you were precise enough and willing enough to go all the way. That certainty was dangerous to every empire that came after. You do not suppress a ritual because it fails. You suppress it because it works, or because the people believe it works, which for the purposes of political authority amounts to exactly the same thing. The people who designed these ceremonies were not primitives groping toward civilization. They were engineers of the threshold. They understood things about the human mind, about pharmacology, about the psychology of death and transformation that we are only now, with modern chemistry and cognitive science, beginning to measure. And the fact that their methods were buried, sometimes under rubble, sometimes under law, sometimes under 5 centuries of uncomfortable academic consensus, is not evidence of failure. If these stories of ancient thresholds and the systematic erasure of our past have changed the way you look at the world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to excavating the history that they tried to bury beneath the rubble of time. Help us plant the seeds for a more conscious future. Our next treasury of secrets will be open soon. Stay curious and keep asking why.